He smirked as he reached behind the server rack and yanked the cable. No offense, Miles, but this thing belongs in a museum. That was Colin Breyer for you. 42 buzzwords for blood and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to clean up your own mess. The junior devs laughed. One of them even clapped. I just stood there, hands still resting on the casing, like I was saying goodbye to a friend. What Colin didn't know was that the moment he pulled that cable, he triggered something he couldn't see. Not an alert, not an outage. A countdown. My name is Miles Trent. I'm 44 years old. For the last 17 years, I've been the senior infrastructure architect at Halvix Corporation. I don't chase titles. I build what holds the weight. The server he unplugged. It wasn't powering a website or storing reports. It was the backbone of the validator, the compliance failsafe that kept our financial records from becoming a federal crime scene. But I didn't stop him. Because months earlier, when I realized what kind of executive Colin really was, I embedded a final protocol, a kill switch, silent. Buried beneath a legacy shell no one bothered to read. He thought he was cutting power to an outdated machine. He was actually unplugging the system that had been shielding the board from $4.6 million worth of exposure. I didn't even blink, just turned, walked out of the room, and let it begin. Before I go, Deeper drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And if you've ever watched someone destroy something they didn't understand, stick around. I want to show you what happened next. 3 years ago, I worked out of a dim, windowless room 2 floors below executive ops. No one visited unless something caught fire. But that room, that's where I felt closest to the truth. It smelled like solder and burnt dust. The backup fans hummed like a tired choir. And on the second rack, running a system most execs had forgotten we still needed sat, the validator. That was mine. I didn't invent the company. I didn't negotiate our biggest acquisitions. But when auditors showed up when clients demanded chain of custody logs, or when one of our junior VPs got too creative with expense reports, my system was the one thing that didn't blink. I built it after the Fisker compliance scare in 2016. That was the week 3 regional execs were nearly indicted. Legal panicked. HR did what HR always does, triaged optics. I sat quietly in that basement and started laying out something stronger. The validator wasn't about real-time metrics or dashboard fluff. It was a forensic mirror-time snapshots, embedded triggers, immutable flags tied to payroll access investment logs, deal flow. Every click recorded, every override noted. At first, no one asked what I was building. They were just relieved the regulators left us alone the next year. By the time we hit $300 million in revenue, the validator was never mentioned out loud, but it was the reason the board slept at night. Then Colin Breyer arrived. He wore charisma like a tailored suit. Actually, he did wear tailored suits. Spoke in revenue multiples, acted like cost centers were personal insults, and called me Dr. Backup the second week he toured my floor. That's how I knew. He wasn't curious about the system. He wanted to control it, or delete it. You know, he said, once hovering near the power cabinet, we spend more maintaining your legacy cluster than it would cost to migrate the entire division to cloud-based redundancy. Just saying. I didn't flinch, just turned back to my console. Redundancy isn't waste, I said. It's what makes failure survivable. He laughed. Come on, Miles. You can't seriously believe this Cold War Frankenstein setup is still protecting us. He was wrong, but it wasn't worth arguing. Instead, that night I ran an update. It wasn't a patch or a firmware upgrade. It was an instruction, a silent embedded clause buried beneath 3 layers of system logic. I called it Protocol Echo 9, a soft fail safeguard, triggered not by intrusion, but by arrogance, by ignorance. From that day forward, if anyone disconnected the validator without clearing compliance verification, Echo 9 would initiate a progressive shutdown, first the audit logs, then transactional timestamps, then the legal timestamp reconciliation keys. Not deletion, just nullification. There's no alert, no alarm, just missing data when someone tried to reconstruct the truth. I told myself I built it for the company's protection, but deep down, I knew better. I built it because men like Colin rise fast, and they rise on the assumption that the people who built the foundation will never fight back. They forget that architects know exactly where the fault lines are buried. The last conversation we had before it all began, he smirked and said, "One day, Miles, this whole building's going to run without a single legacy node. You'll see." I just nodded. He had no idea he was already standing on the trigger. And once he touched it, well, you'll see too. I knew something had shifted the moment I saw the calendar invite. Validator migration proposal. Mandatory. No sender name, just the corporate auto scheduler. But I didn't need a name. I knew whose fingerprints were on it. The meeting was set for Tuesday 9 a.m. Main conference room. No agenda, no attachments. Just one line in the notes, efficiency audit of redundant architecture. Per CFO directive. That's when I started logging everything. Colin Breyer didn't know it yet, but every access request he made, every doc, he opened every Slack DM he sent. About legacy offload strategy I captured and mirrored to Aegis. I kept it clean, unobtrusive, just a trailing shadow beneath the system logs. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to archive. The meeting itself was performance art. Colin walked in 5 minutes late. Sleeves rolled up, tie loose like he'd just stepped off a TEDx stage. He tapped the table with a knuckle like it was a drum line. "All right, let's talk dinosaur bones," he said, grinning like a frat boy in a server room. I didn't say a word, just sat at the far end of the table with my notes open and every log streaming silently in the background on a secure tab. "This validator system," Colin said, sweeping his hand like a magician dismissing fog, is clocking what? Almost 2 decades of code. Now XML wrappers, legacy, Perl, socket calls. No one's documented since Bush was in office. A few chuckles, junior devs, even one of the compliance interns. Across the table, Madeline Sharp cleared her throat. The system still matches core compliance functions for all third-party integrations. It's hardwired into the procurement chain. Colin gave her a smile that said she'd just proven his point. Exactly, hardwired. Into a thing we can't afford to maintain or scale. We don't need a tank to guard a lemonade stand. I glanced at Lucas Delaney. He looked down at his laptop, pretending to scroll. He knew better. He'd helped me patch Protocol Echo 9 3 months ago during a late Friday push. Said it was the most elegant line of code he'd seen since grad school, but now silence. Colin shifted gears. I've already greenlit an initial teardown. Migration teams being assembled. Goal is to sunset Validator by Q3. We'll transition to the off-shelf backbone. That's when I finally spoke. Initiated how? He blinked. Sorry. The Validator stack has to be decommissioned with board-level authorization. That hasn't happened. He leaned forward, voice dropping like a poker player laying down a bluff. I don't need board approval to stop burning money, Miles. I paused, let that settle, then nodded slowly. Understood. That was the moment. Not when he pulled the plug. Not when he mocked the architecture in front of a room full of kids who'd never survived a zero-day exploit. It was the moment I realized he'd declared war and didn't even know what he'd started. That night I stayed late not out of spite, but ritual. I ran a systems health trace across the validator, and in the shell logs beneath the normal flow, one alias flashed green for the first time in 6 years. Aegis mirror listening. I looked at the empty rack bay beside it and remembered something my mentor once told me. Don't ever fight to protect a system. Design it to defend itself. So I stopped fighting and started documenting. He wanted a teardown. I'd give him the full tour. You ever watch someone order their own execution and smile while doing it? I did. And next time, I'll tell you what happened when he handed the migration order to the junior team. That's when the countdown really began. By Thursday morning, the glitch wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a pulse. I walked into the server room at 6:38 a.m., same routine I'd followed for over 11 years. But this time, the validator was flashing amber. Not offline, not yet. But the logs told a different story. Someone had bypassed the routing tables. Manual cooling override. System strain increasing in 5-minute intervals. A slow kill. I didn't move. I just stood there watching the lights flicker in that familiar cadence. Green, amber, amber. Pause. That was the moment I knew. He really touched it. Colin Breyer had pulled the plug on the legacy spine. Let me back up for a second. The validator wasn't some dusty rack we forgot to upgrade. It was a hybrid compliance core, something I built 6 years ago, long before modular infrastructure became trendy on CIO panels. That server did more than process tasks. It verified integrity across 8 zones, flagged discrepancies in fiscal tags, encrypted logs automatically into a sandboxed mirror node I called Aegis Mirror. To anyone else, it looked like a legacy holdover. To me, it was the firewall beneath the firewall. And when Colin sent Lucas Delaney down to optimize loadouts, I knew he wasn't just tweaking architecture. He was tripping Protocol Echo 9. That wasn't a panic button. It was a silent observer, my way of freezing the audit trail long enough for someone with clearance and intention to see what had changed. A kill switch, yes, but not one that made a scene. Lucas had no idea. His credentials didn't have clearance to trigger a shutdown. I traced his activity routine scrub, tagged as pre-integration, harmless, which meant only one thing. Colin did it himself. I checked Slack. No ping, no ticket, not even a false outage alert. My chest tightened not from panic, but from clarity. So I walked upstairs. The hallway smelled like burnt espresso and ambition. 2 junior execs were shouting buzzwords at a glass board: velocity, marginify, customer fluidity. Across the corridor, Meline Sharp looked up from her monitor. Our eyes met for a second. She looked drained, almost like she knew something was coming. I reached Colin's office and knocked once. He didn't look up. Not a good time. The validator's in thermal override, I said. Amber state. Looks like a manual throttle. He finally glanced at me. Not concerned, not surprised, just annoyed. Like I was interrupting a keynote he was giving to himself. We're sunsetting that system anyway, he said. Let it burn out. Let it burn out. That was it. No follow-up, no acknowledgement that the validator backed our compliance verification, that it generated audit logs for external regulators, that it was still quietly keeping the board from eating a lawsuit. And that's when it clicked. He didn't care what it did. He only cared it still had my name on the build log. This wasn't just about infrastructure. It was about erasure. The validator was proof that something before him had worked, that someone else, someone without PowerPoint decks and innovation jargon, had built something that couldn't be easily replaced. He didn't want to replace it. He wanted to bury it. And I did what he never expected. I let him. No report, no Slack escalation, no angry memo to Meline. I walked back downstairs, past the humming servers, past the amber pulses, and I triggered Protocol Echo 9. Just once. It didn't crash anything, not yet, but it locked the system state, froze the current architecture, applied a zero modification policy that required certified executive override to lift. And that meant every downstream node, transaction chains, vendor portals, audit logs, would begin flagging changes as anomalies. Those flags, they don't get ignored. In 48 hours, they trigger an automatic escalation protocol, straight to the board. And Lucas, he was the first to go. His badge didn't scan the next morning. He texted me once short, confused. I didn't respond. I should have warned him. Should have told him it wasn't his fault, that the system had chosen its moment and he was standing in the wrong room when it did. For a second, I almost walked upstairs and told Colin to undo it, to reverse the badge flag and fix the logs. But I didn't, because Lucas wasn't the real collateral. The system was. And I had already watched it get dismantled piece by people who didn't understand it and didn't want to. So now I let the flags build. And the board. They'd be hearing from the validator soon. I hadn't even touched the real payload yet. Not the one buried in Aegis Mirror. That part comes next. But tell me something. What would you have done? If the one thing you built that worked was being erased in silence, would you stay silent too? By Friday morning, Meline finally knocked. Not stormed in, not called an emergency meeting. Just a soft knock at my office door. Miles, we're getting elevated flags from 3 external vendors, all tagged audit holds. Do you know anything about that? Her tone was cautious, professional, but clipped. She'd seen this kind of smoke before, but not from my stack. I turned my monitor, slightly showing her the validator's heat trace logs. The amber pulse had stabilized, but Protocol Echo 9 had done its job. The system state was sealed, and every deviation since was being logged quietly, irrevocably. Echo 9's active, I said, triggered manually, on Thursday. She frowned. Why wasn't I notified? It didn't trip the compliance chain, just a freeze, temporary, controlled. You're not cleared to lock protocol channels without a flag to infrastructure risk, unless there's credible reason to suspect tampering. I watched her face change, slight, but enough. She sat down. Colin said you were resistant to systems evolution, that you'd hardwired non-compliant override barriers into deprecated systems. I waited. She looked back at the screen. But these logs, they're clean, transparent, documented. That's what I built them for. She didn't say anything for a while, just looked at the stream of node activity bleeding into Aegis Mirror, the kind of data trail you don't see unless you know where to look, and Meline did. That's what made her dangerous, but also useful. I'm going to need to run a protocol validation review, she said finally. You'll need to sit in with Colin. I assumed that I said, tell me when. She paused at the door. Miles. This thing you're doing, is it about the infrastructure? I looked at her. It's about what they think they can get away with, and what happens when someone who actually knows how it all works stops cleaning up behind them. She left, and that's when I opened the real window. Aegis Mirror wasn't just a logging alias. It was a forensic ghost, the metadata container I'd seeded 5 years ago after a vendor dispute nearly cost us our FISMA certification. It captured Delta states before and after edits and scrubbed out variable noise. Not to deceive, to preserve clarity. And what it preserved yesterday was Colin's override key. His personal credential was embedded in the manual failover attempt. And I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Because Echo 9 didn't just freeze the validator. It sent silent pings signed with my archive keys to our 3 largest regulatory-facing partners. Nothing urgent, just routine integrity check digests. Like an old dog stretching its legs and sniffing the perimeter. I wasn't trying to burn the building down. Not yet. I was just letting the sprinkler system test its range. You ever wonder what happens when someone in power rewrites the rules, and the rules decide to reply? I didn't need to fight back. I just needed them to remember who built it. Hit like and subscribe if you've lived that truth too. By the time lunch rolled around, Lucas was at my desk. Hey, just wanted to check something. Did you modify any of the test scripts I ran last week? He was nervous, fidgeting. No, I said, but you ran them through the validator instance. Yeah, Colin said to validate against both stacks old and new, but now it's showing compliance lock, and I think I accidentally tripped a vendor access freeze. I nodded. You didn't trip anything. The system's just telling the truth. His eyes widened. Am I in trouble? No, Lucas, but someone is. He nodded slowly, like someone realizing he was sitting on a train track, not in front of the train, but directly behind it, watching where it came from. Before he left, he said, You ever name a server before? I half smiled. Once. You called it the validator. No, I said. I called it insurance. And by Monday morning, the board would read the policy. Because buried inside Aegis Mirror was a time-stamped audit proof that would make Colin wish he'd never touched a server in his life. When I arrived Monday morning, the flags had spread. I didn't need admin access to see it. Half the sandbox environments were locked behind protocol warnings. The weekly sync dashboard was throwing checksum errors, and 2 finance microservices were timing out on authentication cycles. But no one said anything directly. That's how you know something serious is happening in a corporate environment, when things go quiet, not loud. I walked past Lucas's desk. He was hunched forward, palms pressed together like he was praying to his screen. He looked up. Did you change the compliance script library? I paused. No, because it's reverting to a version I've never seen, with metadata tags from, 2019. That's odd, I said. Maybe Colin's optimization sweep is still running. He blinked hard. I didn't touch anything this morning. It just started locking me out. I gave him a nod. Might want to open a ticket. I knew exactly what he was seeing. Protocol Echo 9 was now forcing a cascade freeze, gradual, precise quiet. It wouldn't crash anything. Just make every oversight impossible to ignore. Downstairs, I caught Meline sharp in the hallway outside the compliance review room. She had a stack of printouts and a frown that hadn't left her face in 3 days. Morning, Miles. You look like you slept here. I practically did. Someone's audit script triggered a retroactive hold on Q3 vendor payments. Half our cross-region validations are getting kicked back. That's disruptive. Meline stared at me for a beat too long. Did you insert anything into validator routing before the optimization cycle? I met her eyes. Calm. Nothing that wasn't in the continuity plan. Everything else would have been scrubbed by Lucas. She didn't blink. That system's got your fingerprints all over it. And I've always documented my changes. She looked down at the files, jaw tight. If this is retaliation, I need to know now. It's not. Not yet. But here's the thing. In this kind of collapse, no one's ever sure where the fire started. Just where the smoke is blowing. Later that afternoon, a whisper made its way into the second-floor kitchen. The board had called an emergency meeting. No agenda shared. Colin tried to brush it off, just standard quarterly prep. But by 4 p.m., someone from legal requested a change log of infrastructure commits dating back 18 months. And by 6:45, I received a calendar invite. Wednesday, closed session, 1 hour. Required attendees, me, Meline, Colin, and someone I didn't recognize. A quick search showed her title, Interim Risk Counsel, External. I closed the invite, then opened Aegis Mirror. I hadn't touched it in nearly a year. It wasn't flashy, just a node pathway I embedded into Validator's deeper compliance spine, invisible to surface systems. But it held the heartbeat of every critical transaction routing we'd ever run. And more importantly, it tracked overrides. Not just who triggered them, but who should have flagged them and didn't. I hovered over the encryption key. One tap and the trail would become visible. But I didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, I sat back in my chair, staring at the flicker of the validator through the glass wall of the server room. There was a time I built systems to protect people, to keep the company whole. Now I was watching the same system quietly demand the one thing that frightened Colin Breyer most: accountability. Oh, and you know what? It wasn't rage driving me anymore. It was something colder: resolution. We all leave fingerprints on the things we build, but some of us also leave signatures. Let me ask you something just between us. Have you ever worked with someone who was so focused on erasing your legacy, they forgot you were still watching? Because that's when it becomes personal. That's when the silence starts speaking. And what happens Wednesday? Well, that's when the silence gets documented. The first visible glitch hit the live payment reconciliation and dashboard at 11:42 a.m. A vendor flagged it in a routine call. Transactions were syncing, but the timestamps weren't lining up. 3 minutes off. Not enough to trigger panic, but enough to make someone nervous. I wasn't in the room when it hit, but I was CC'd. Meline Sharp escalated it to Colin in under 10 minutes. She framed it as a minor sync irregularity. Colin forwarded it to Lucas with one line, "Clean this up by EOD." No investigation, no root cause request, just pressure. Lucas called me from the hallway. I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't panicked yet, just confused. "Was there a scheduled patch on the validator?" he asked. "No," I said. There was a visibility hold. Echo 9 flagged the stack 48 hours ago. You didn't see the system note. Silence, then a breath. Protocol. Echo 9? I thought that was deprecated. "It's not," I said quietly. "It's triggered when upstream compliance thresholds are hit, like when someone tries to bypass the root logging schema." More silence. "Then I didn't do that, Miles." "I know, and I meant it." Lucas wasn't the type. He still triple-checked config files before pushing to staging. He still asked permission. What he didn't realize was that his access badge was being used to rewrite system history, without him knowing. That evening, I reviewed the Aegis Mirror logs again. It wasn't just override attempts anymore. It was full-on timestamp manipulation. Compliance windows artificially shifted to cover blackout periods. Colin, or someone using his root, was trying to make it look like nothing had happened during the validator's thermal event, which told me one thing: the board was about to be briefed. Not on the real glitch, on the version Colin wanted them to see. He wasn't just erasing infrastructure, he was writing a new narrative. That was the moment I knew I had to act. Not retaliate, not sabotage, but document. Because I wasn't going to fight this in a war room. I was going to bury it in the audit chain. I spent that night writing a compliance memo, not an alarmist one, just detailed enough to raise concern. I walked through the override timestamps, the cooling stack flags, the intentional bypasses of system escalation thresholds. I included the Echo 9 tag, the visibility lockout, and the tampering logs from Aegis Mirror, subtly marked with metadata fingerprints. And I routed it not to Meline, not to Colin, but to Diana Keller. She wasn't internal yet. She'd been hired as a third-party PR consultant after our last vendor outage, but she had board access. I didn't even know if she'd read it, but it didn't matter, because what I was really doing was triggering the final failover sequence. The validator was never meant to scream. It was designed to hum quietly until someone asked the wrong question. At 2:17 p.m. the next day, Colin stood in front of the executive suite with a prepared slide deck trying to explain why the Q3 infrastructure budget needed a 22% cut. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the screen behind him was frozen. Not the slides, the dashboard, the live one. Red warning banners crawled across the monitor in real time: vendor sync failure, compliance hold, Aegis exception triggered. Every pair of eyes turned from Colin to the screen, then to Meline. Meline turned to me. I didn't move, just folded my hands and said, Looks like a validator conflict. Might want to check with legal. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Some part of her already knew. And Colin, he did the worst thing a man like him could do. He laughed. A short, breathy chuckle. This is why we're replacing these legacy stacks. This is exactly why. But I saw it, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the tick in his jaw, the realization that for all his disruption, for all his transformation buzzwords, there were still some systems in this company that refused to forget, especially the ones built to remember. Before we move forward, let me ask you something. Have you ever worked somewhere that treated your work like an artifact from a past they couldn't wait to erase? If that hits you anywhere deep, hit like, subscribe, stick around. I've got more to say. Because what came next? That was just the echo. The mirror hadn't spoken yet, and when it did, it wouldn't be quiet. I didn't go home that night. I slept in the network lab tucked behind the secondary rack wall hoodie over my head, the validator humming beside me like a memory. By morning, the system had done exactly what I designed it to do. Not collapse, not crash, just resist. The vendor payment gateway had suspended 2 scheduled transactions, one of them flagged for certificate mismatch, the other for metadata signature inconsistency. Translation. The server didn't recognize its new administrator. Meline was in a conference room on the 17th floor when she called me. Why is finance getting automated warnings from Aegis Mirror? She wasn't hostile. Not yet. Just rattled. But I could hear the pacing in her voice. She knew this wasn't a normal permissions bug. I said, because it's not a bug. I met her upstairs. She was already looping in Lucas, who looked like he hadn't slept either. He brought a copy of the access logs, which was pointless because I'd already printed my own. Mine had the part he didn't know how to find. There's a fail-safe protocol in place, I said calmly, as if I wasn't exhausted and one strong coffee away from boiling over. It's locking down any system that's been flagged for legacy override without compliant metadata. Lucas stared at me. You mean you built a compliance firewall? No, I built a memory. That landed. Because this wasn't just about permissions or backups or cold storage. It was about the architecture, about everything we'd logged and encrypted and hashed for over a decade, about the fact that when you gut a system but leave the skeleton in place, the bones still know who built them. And when those bones start rejecting new DNA, it doesn't mean they're broken. It means they remember. Meline didn't say anything. She just turned toward the window. Her silence said more than any argument ever could. She knew. The truth was baked in now. Signed, mirrored, verified. Because back then, I still thought Halvix had a future worth protecting. I was wrong. By noon, a Level 2 audit had been auto-triggered by Echo 9's external compliance indicator. 2 external vendors were calling legal. The Aegis node had generated a compliance heat map, showing 9 systems affected by attempted override injections. But the system wouldn't let anyone in. Not without the original key signature, my signature. I watched the access logs for 6 hours. I saw every attempt. Lucas tried twice, then legal, then Meline, then someone from Diana Keller's team. And then Colin. He tried once at 4:23 p.m. from the executive subnet, using admin override credentials. Aegis Mirror rejected it. Because the override had been nullified the moment he triggered the thermal throttle. Because the validator doesn't serve people, it serves the truth. And Colin Breyer's name is all over it. 3 days after the validator stopped reporting upstream logs, Colin Breyer was still strutting around like a man who just put out a fire without realizing he was breathing in the smoke. The Slack thread started at 7:04 a.m. Meline Sharp Validator reports down for 3rd day. Confirmed via Aegis Mirror. No response from integration lead. Action plan. Colin replied, 11 minutes later, Colin Breyer Validator is outdated. Not mission critical. Prioritize Cortex migration. Stop wasting cycles. That was the moment I knew the fuse had finally reached the charge. He wasn't just dismissing a compliance monitor. He was unknowingly greenlighting its total removal. Without the validator running, protocol Echo 9 had no break. It was never meant to go off this soon, but now I wasn't going to stop it. There's a peculiar numbness that sets in when you see something you designed doing exactly what you feared and wanted. At first it was just subtle. A missing escalation report here, a mismatched line in the vendor compliance feed. But by midweek, I caught something deeper. An automated security digest referencing an outdated audit node, Aegis Mirror flagged, last synced 46 days ago. Except I had rewritten Aegis Mirror's backend to respond only to a separate protocol layer, one only I knew how to decrypt. When I reviewed the digest timestamp and compared it to my buried logic thread inside the validator's fallback memory, I saw it. The collapse had already begun, not with a bang, but with silence. Quiet systems stopped listening. Subroutines skipped tasks they had always performed. The lights were on, but no one was home. Lucas Delaney messaged me in the afternoon. Hey, should I be worried about these network health alerts from the DR node they're showing? Timeout loops since last patch. Colin said, ignore, but I stared at the message. Lucas wasn't part of this. I never wanted him to be, but the system didn't know that. And Protocol Echo 9 had no friend filter, just conditions, just triggers. I typed and erased my response 4 times. Then I wrote, document everything. Don't fix anything yet. Trust me. I heard nothing back for an hour. Then a simple thumbs up emoji. That's when I realized even the innocent need an exit plan. By Thursday, the finance systems flagged 3 vendor payments as incomplete signature chain. It wasn't a real error. It was Echo 9's signature obfuscation routine, what I'd once described in a buried white paper draft as a regulatory mirror layer mimicking external authentication delays. Translation: the system was faking slowness to buy me time. To buy the company time. To buy them time to see what they had ignored. Meline sent out an emergency compliance review for Friday morning. Colin declined it publicly in the thread. Colin Breyer Validator is non-essential. Meline focus resources where they count. This isn't a tech panic, it's a leadership opportunity. That was his brand of arrogance. Turn a malfunction into a motivational poster. Except he never asked the obvious question. What happens if the legacy system isn't broken? But waiting. I remember my wife once asked me back when I first wrote the Echo 9 protocol in our basement. Why would you build something that powerful and hide it from everyone? I told her the truth. Because someday someone's going to come along who thinks he understands the system better than the guy who built it. And that's exactly what Colin Breyer did. By Friday at 3 p.m., 5 of Halvik's partner gateways had dropped their handshake validations. Madeline's team requested a rollback, but it was too late. Echo 9 had disabled permission reinstatement on invalidated credential paths. The network wasn't just failing, it was rejecting repairs. Lucas pinged me again this time with a screenshot of the terminal. Can you confirm this error code? Aegis lock, code, GIS9, override. I didn't reply, because by then I'd already written the final trigger line into the system log queue, and once it cycled through the validator's memory dump, they'd learned the one thing no amount of funding or posturing could save them from. The system wasn't broken. It was listening, and now it had spoken. 3 days after the breach made headlines, my phone buzzed with a calendar invite I never expected to see again. Internal strategy alignment, emergency review with Diana Keller. No subject line, no attached agenda. Just Diana's name and a Zoom link. I stared at it for a full minute. Then I smiled, tight quiet. I clicked accept, but I didn't say a word. When the call opened, she was already there. Calm, composed, too composed. Miles, she nodded like this was a routine Tuesday. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of a whiteboard littered with red scribbles. Keywords like redundancy third-party audit, NYDFS disclosure, all capitalized and underlined. The cleanup had begun. We'd like to explore an external contractor arrangement, she said, to assist with the investigation and stabilize what's recoverable from the validator framework. There it was. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgement, just a line item buried in sanitized legal language, a request wrapped in pride. I waited, let the silence stretch past the point of comfort. Diana didn't blink. She finally added, the board is prepared to authorize a 6-month retainer market rate with indemnification from all prior actions. We'd consider this an act of mutual benefit. You wouldn't be reinstated, just consulted. I almost laughed, not out of joy, out of something colder, something cleaner. The validator had stopped blinking 2 nights ago, at least externally. What Diana didn't know was that Protocol Echo 9 had nested itself inside Aegis Mirror, the internal audit logging node I designed before the layoffs. It didn't require activation anymore. It had already been watching. Let me be clear, I said. You want me to document a system I was told to decommission. You want clarity on a framework that was mocked in the Q4 performance review. And you want me to clean up a mess I was fired for preventing. Diana didn't argue. She just sat there waiting. She knew the answer. Everyone did. "I'm not angry," I said softly. But legacy doesn't belong to people who laughed at it. For a moment I thought she might say something, some half-hearted defense. But she only closed her notebook and said, "We'll note your position." I ended the call without another word. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the room at the old monitor I kept, powered off a relic from my first day at Halvik's. The screen flickered to life, not by accident, by confirmation. The validator had just logged a new access attempt. The board was still probing, still desperate. And next week, when the FTC inquiry publishes its early findings, they'll have to explain exactly why an unsecured deactivation script was run from Colin Breyer's own account. They never understood the difference between access and control. I did. And control was just beginning to shift. The boardroom felt colder than the server rooms I used to live in. Diana Keller had been brought in to manage the PR fallout, but by now there was nothing left to spin. I sat across from her at the emergency session, quiet, listening. She'd reviewed the final report, 12 pages of procedural breakdown, data, inconsistencies, and vendor alerts that all traced back to one thing: the validator. Or, more precisely, what had been embedded inside it: Protocol Echo 9. Meline Sharp was nowhere in sight. Word was she had submitted a formal leave request that morning, citing severe professional fatigue. Translation: she saw the writing on the wall. Colin Breyer had tried to bluff his way through the audit committee. It's a technical failure, not a strategic one. But the logs didn't lie. Every access point led back to decisions he approved. Every redacted vendor submission, every override signed by him. And Lucas Delaney, still stunned. No one blamed him, not really. He'd triggered the sequence without knowing. That's how Echo 9 was designed. A clean failover command embedded deep within a dependency network of trusted node access. Invisible, legal, triggered only when the compliance stack reached 7 unresolved flags. I'd built it after the second time Colin blew off a vendor escalation, back when I still believed the system could save us from him. But the moment they let me go, I knew it wouldn't be saving anyone. It would only record. The validator wasn't just a server, it was a memory, a ledger of every ignored flag, every overwritten approval, every time someone like Colin thought policy was optional if the numbers looked good enough on paper. That morning, Diana finally asked me the one question no one else had dared. "Why didn't you tell someone sooner?" I looked her in the eye and said it plainly. Because I did, for 3 years, and they promoted the man who ignored every warning. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the note she scribbled shift in tone. They were now calling it a systemic leadership failure, a term that neatly skipped over names but not consequences. Halvik's corporation, once worth $1.2 billion in infrastructure equity, was officially on acquisition watch. The buyer, a mid-size firm from Phoenix that I'd quietly been advising, one that didn't treat governance like a suggestion. By the end of the week, the validator was disconnected, but not before Diana archived every log. I walked out of that building for the last time, not with vengeance in my chest, but something colder, a silence I'd waited years to earn. And I wasn't done yet, because the next move wouldn't come from me. It would come from the outside world finally seeing what I'd seen all along. And someone else was about to ask the question Colin Breyer couldn't answer. If your systems were compliant, why did they shut down the moment he left? I don't think Colin Breyer ever really understood what the validator was. To him, it was a punchline, a clunky legacy server humming away in the corner, a relic from a pre-cloud era. He mocked it in meetings, called it my personal museum exhibit. But the validator wasn't just hardware. It was the foundation, our original compliance spine, our earliest encrypted transaction logs, the only unaltered record Halvik still had after 3 digital overhauls. And that's why I built Protocol Echo 9 inside it. Not as sabotage, as insurance. It wasn't activated when Colin stripped my team budget, or when he cut back-end redundancies and ignored my audit memos. It wasn't even triggered when he laughed during that quarterly call and said, "No one uses mirrors when you've got satellites." It activated the night they voted to erase the validator entirely in a board meeting I wasn't invited to. The final trigger was tied to internal wipe requests matching the validator's archive checksum. No override, no warning, just silence. Then, cascade. By the time the backup registries failed and the legal hold on SEC documentation was broken, Colin was still blaming junior devs. I heard from Diana Keller, the general counsel, at 3:04 a.m. Her voicemail just said, "Whatever this is, It's real, and it's everywhere. The board initiated a full investigation the next day. Diana resigned quietly. Madeline Sharp from HR disappeared into a leave of absence, but the fallout couldn't be contained. When the forensic audit traced the timeline of compliance failure, it didn't stop at Colin. It enveloped everyone who signed off on deleting the validator. 5 board members stepped down in 1 week, and Colin, he lost everything. Not just his role, but his standing. His severance was nullified under executive breach. Halvix's stock never recovered. Protocol Echo 9 was decommissioned after the audit concluded. I let it go, but I kept the encrypted drive cold storage unplugged sealed. Not for revenge, for record. I never wanted them ruined. I wanted them accountable. I wanted them to look at that humming server in the corner and realize that's where their empire stood. On the unglamorous systems they never respected. On the hands they dismissed. These days I work in silence, consulting, quiet systems architecture, no titles, no org charts. But sometimes I get brought in when someone whispers the word whistleblower. It's strange how the thing they laughed at became the thing that saved me, that saved the truth. There's still one line of code I remember, buried deep in the validator's command chain. A diagnostic string I wrote in the middle of a lonely night back in 2015. It read, "Trust is a mirror. Shatter it once, and it reflects differently forever." Colin never saw that line, but I like to think he feels it every time he walks past a server room now. And that was always the point. Not revenge. Recognition. If you've ever had to choose between silence and self-respect, I hope this story gave you something to hold on to. Share your own experience in the comments. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one about quiet power-earned justice and legacy that can't be erased.